که این برنامه ضبط میشه همه باید اطلاع داشته باشن. بعداً این برنامه ها در کانال یوتیوب کانون قابل دسترسی خواهد بود و دوستانی که این برنامه رو از دست دادن میتونن توی کانال یوتیوب کانون ایرانیان بوستون برن و این برنامه‌های قدیمی تر رو تماشا کنن. همین الان مقدار زیادی کار داره میشه که این ویدیوهای برنامه‌های قبلی ادیت بشن و توی اون کانال یوتیوب گذاشته بشن. من دیگه سرتون رو درد نمیارم. در ضمن بجز من و خانم مرجان کمالی مهمان عزیز مجری برنامه‌مون خانم لادن خمسی، جناب دکتر لطیف پورم کماکان همیشه اینجا کمک کردن و کمک میکنن و در پشت صحنه همونجور که دیدین یه موسیقی بسیار قشنگی با اسلاید شو ما رو مهمون کردن. به هر حال من از همه دوستان تشکر میکنم. همونجور گفتم خانم لادن خمسی she really appreciates the narrative and recreating Iranian history, stories and sentiments from the Iranian American and Iranians who live outside of Iran for the community. She's read Mrs. Kamali's books and she's delighted to be introducing her tonight. Mrs. Ladan Khamsi is a graduate of Boston University with a major in English literature. She's lived in Boston area with her family for over 35 years with a career in finance and operations. She's been retired for some years now. I've had the fortune of meeting her mother and her brothers, and I know that they have been in Boston area and contributing in all cultural and social activities of the Iranian community. Ladan, befirmayid.
Thank you so much. This is about Marjan, so I'm going to go right to it. Salam be hamegi. It is my pleasure to introduce Marjan Kamali. Marjan, welcome to the IAB. Marjan Kamali is the award-winning author of Together Tea, a Massachusetts Book Award finalist, and The Stationery Shop, a national bestseller. She is a 2022 recipient of the National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellowship, and her books are named as Boston Globe bestsellers, as NPR's Bestsellers of the Year, and also Goodreads Great Books, among other accolades around, international accolades that she's collected. Marjan's novels are published in translation in more than 20 languages, and The Stationery Shop was awarded the Prix Attitude in France. Her essays have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Literary Hub, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Born in Turkey to Iranian parents, Kamali spent her childhood in Turkey, Iran, Germany, Kenya, and the US. She currently teaches creative writing at Grub Street and lives in the Boston area with her family. Marjan holds a bachelor's degree in English literature from University of California, Berkeley, an MBA from Columbia University, and a master's of fine arts in creative writing from New York University. By the way, The Stationery Shop is getting a television series adaptation at HBO, and we all can't wait to watch it. So here we go. Marjan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for spending Friday night with me. از همگی تشکر میکنم و عذرخواهی میکنم که فارسی من خیلی خوب نیست. من روحم رفته، در عمرم 4 سال در ایران بودم، برای همین برای حرفای روزمره میتونم فارسی صحبت کنم، اما متاسفانه برای چیزای جدی‌تر فکر کنم برای همه بهتره اگه متن امشب رو به انگلیسی بدم. So thank you so much. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And the Iranian Association of Boston has been a part of our own lives here for my family. My kids were there for Charshanbe Suri when they were little, and the kids' Nowruz activities, and took the Farsi classes. And it's a beautiful organization. So it's an honor to be hosted by you tonight. I wanted to speak to you tonight. You know, I give a lot of book talks and I talk a lot about my journey to how I became a writer, but given the audience tonight is mostly Iranian, and given that we're speaking at an Iranian association, I thought that I would give you the version that is truest to what it means to be an Iranian American author, not just an author, because believe me when I tell you, it's different. And the path that I had to take to coming to where I am today was constantly defined by being Iranian. And sometimes the obstacles were there because I was Iranian. So basically, the question I get asked a lot is, if you didn't live in Iran so much, you know, all told, I lived there between the ages of 2 and 5, and then again between 9 and 10 and a half. And people say, why do you write about Iran? Because clearly I'm not someone who was born and raised there. But that's exactly why I write about Iran, because I didn't spend a lot of time there. I was there only less than 4 years of my whole life, and my family lived all over the world. So I've lived in 7 countries and 5 continents. But no matter where I lived, no matter where we were in this world, whether it was Kenya, Germany, the US, the home I came to at the end of every day was an Iranian home. So the minute I stepped into my parents' home, you know, we were having Persian food, we were speaking mostly Persian, and I was being taught about the Iranian culture and Persian poetry and literature. So I was constantly connected to the culture, maybe even more so because we were always abroad. So my parents felt even more of a need to teach me about the country they loved. And when I was a child, there seemed to be very little disconnect between the stories my parents were sharing about the country they were born and raised in and people's impressions overall. But I do remember the day when all of that changed. And we were in Nairobi at the time, and I was asked to stand up in the middle of the class by my teacher. And she also had, I was in an international school, so it was an international school. She had a young boy in my class who was American also stand up, so he stood up. And then she asked me to apologize to him. And I truly had no idea what she was talking about. And I said, but why do I have to apologize to him? And she said, I can't believe you don't even know what your country did. You need to apologize to Greg. And so I sort of did a very half-hearted apology. And then we sat back down. And when I went home, I later learned that the reason she wanted me to apologize to this boy was because he was American and Iran had taken American hostages. At that time, I was 8 years old, and I remember thinking, this feels not right. The fact that, you know, I am being held responsible for the actions of a government, actions I wasn't even really aware of. But it became clear to me in the years ensuing that the vision people had, the impression people had of Iran was very different, not just from the impression my parents had and I myself had, but also from maybe the thoughts they themselves held before the revolution, before the hostages. So I ironically went back to Iran after the revolution. My family went back and things quickly, changed. The laws changed and the war began. And many of you joining us tonight have memories of the Iran-Iraq war, and you remember being in the basement shelters, you remember the sirens, you remember what that was like. And I know for me as a child, every time, we left the basement, there was an incredible amount of relief because we were going back up, we made it. And there was also the awareness that not everybody had. And so when we left Iran and came to the US, that feeling stayed with me. I was well aware of all my relatives who were staying behind, well aware of the people still suffering through the war. The war that happened between Iran and Iraq for 8 years didn't get the international attention, for example, that the Russian war with Ukraine is getting today. And you could argue about the reasons why, but it doesn't make it any less traumatic just because the world's attention wasn't focused on it. And it doesn't make it any less important. So I came to the United States when I was 10 and a half, almost 11, and I started a new life in New York City. And people constantly asked me, how are you dealing with the culture shock? Because they knew I'd come from Tehran. And I didn't have the heart to tell them that, the clothes were different, the language was different, the politics were different, but people are the same. People are the same wherever you go. I think they wanted me to give a different answer, but the truth was we had mean teachers in Iran, we had mean teachers in the US. The dynamics on the playground were the same. You had the same mean girls. It's just not something that people necessarily accept, but having lived in 7 countries, I can assure you that though certain cultural traditions are very different, at the core, human beings are the same. And so as I was growing up, I was constantly reading, constantly writing, and also well aware that the stories I was reading didn't include much about Iran. Books certainly didn't. And movies and TV shows did, but in a way it was better if they didn't, because if we had not been represented at all, I think I would have felt, okay, there's no representation. Maybe somebody needs to speak up. But we were being represented just constantly in a negative light, in this absurd stereotype, so movies like Not Without My Daughter and big Hollywood films where the terrorists were Iranian, so that kind of a thing. And I remember as I made my way through adolescence, wanting to be a writer, recognizing it wasn't necessarily a career I could pursue because Iranian immigrants became doctors and lawyers and engineers and not really artists, at least the first generation. I remember thinking, though, wouldn't it be nice if somebody wrote a book about an Iranian family who were filled with joy and complications and the usual nuances that families have? Wouldn't that be nice? And, I graduated high school, I entered college, I was still looking for that book, didn't exist at the time. Even the term Iranian American wasn't used that much at the time. And then finally, when I was 19, I was telling a friend of mine this, and she said, well, you write it. And I was like, well, I can't because I'm very busy and I have to do this and that. But I realized as the years went on, perhaps I should write it. So that was my new goal, except I was that child who left the war who left Iran, and I was very busy trying to contribute, getting degrees, what many of you have done, I'm sure, in this audience tonight, achieving, overachieving, basically building a foundation in this country and attempting to not really prove our worth, but be good citizens and contribute. So long story short, I ended up in business school. And I was sitting there in the MBA program, and the MBA program had those of us who had more of a liberal arts background start off in a program called Math Camp. And so they brought us up to speed with things like calculus and spreadsheets. And I was sitting there and our professor was teaching us about spreadsheets, and I kept daydreaming because I really wanted to be in the building across the way on the Columbia campus, which was the Master of Fine Arts building. The creative writing program was there. But I started to fantasize about the use of spreadsheets. And I thought, what if a mother used spreadsheets to find the perfect formula for her daughter's future husband, and started to crunch in these numbers. And that right then and there in that classroom, in that lecture hall, I started to write in my notebook this story about a mother so obsessed with math that she creates spreadsheets in Excel to find her daughter the perfect husband. And that became the first chapter of my first novel, Together Tea. And Together Tea is an immigration story. It's, yes, about a mother obsessed with math, making spreadsheets for khasegari, but it's also an immigration story about a family who leaves Iran shortly after the start of the war and comes to New York and adjusts to life in New York. And I would like to read for you from my first book, just one paragraph. This is Together Tea. It's now been out since 2013, so I guess next year it's the 10-year anniversary, which is hard to believe. But in these 10 years, many wonderful things have happened with this book. It's been adapted for a play. I had the privilege of seeing actors play it out. But the one thing that always comes back is this paragraph. When I get letters from Iranian Americans, usually young Iranian Americans, they reference this paragraph. So I'll just read you that paragraph. Mina knew how to study and work very hard. She knew how to swing her legs on that hyphen that defined and denied who she was, Iranian American. Neither the first word nor the second really belonged to her. Her place was on the hyphen, and on the hyphen she would stay, carrying memories of the one place from which she had come and the other place in which she must succeed. The hyphen was hers, a space small, potentially precarious. On the hyphen she would sit, and on the hyphen she would stand, and soon, like a seasoned acrobat, she would balance there perfectly, never falling, never choosing either side over the other, content with walking that thin line. So that's just towards the beginning of the book, and the family, obviously, it then sort of becomes this love story because mother and daughter go back to Iran in the 1990s. And lo and behold, despite all the khasegari attempts, Mr. Right is found in Iran. I won't say more in case people don't want spoilers. But after this book came out, I was, honestly, I was thrilled because let me tell you, considering our audience tonight, this took 10 years to write, 10 years to publish, I should say, because I finished it. I finished the first draft in 2002. And I had the privilege of meeting with publishing professionals in New York City to discuss this book. And they had read the draft and they liked my writing. But I was told in a meeting that the father in Together Tea was too nice to be a Muslim man. And I was asked to change him. And they looked me in the eye and they said, maybe you could add a scene where he beats up his wife or something that would make him more believable for being a Muslim man. And I remember sitting in that meeting, just my heart sinking, because here I'd worked so hard on this manuscript and I was being told to change it in a way that I would refuse to change it. So I said to them, that's not what I wanted to do. That's not the kind of man this character was. And they said, well, then you won't publish it, because that's what people want. That's what people want when they pick up a book about the Middle East, when they pick up a book about Iran. And I left the meeting. And you know what? They were right. It didn't get published. It did not get published until more than 10 years later. Now, granted, I then changed it. The manuscript needed a lot of revisions anyway. So I'm glad it took the time it took, because it improved. I got older, it improved. I'm just giving you that as an example of some of the obstacles that we face. We faced, I should say. It's getting better now. But there's constantly stereotypes that editors and publishing professionals almost expect. And then you have to push back. You constantly have to fight. And sometimes that means you have to wait. You have to wait a long time. So that's Together Tea. Then it did come out and we had a wonderful time, and I went on book tour and it started to get translated into other languages. And it was a Massachusetts Book Award finalist, which was great. But you know what? My biggest triumph with this book is when people write to me, they love the father. They love the father. And they say, I love that father. So I'm really glad I didn't change him, you know, not that I would have anyway. So that's Together Tea, but I was having a great time. And then people kept saying, well, when's the next book coming out? And I realized, oh, so I guess you have to do this again. I didn't, think about that much. But so then I was thinking about a topic for the next book, and people, I remember at one book reading said, will your next book take place also in Iran and the US? And I said, yes. And then she said, oh, but you already wrote about Iran. And I said, well, I mean, people write about America and they might write 7 books about America. Like, there are more stories to tell. So it was, in fact, for Together Tea, I was at a book club, and the people in the book club, one of them asked me to visit where she worked. She worked in an assisted living center, and I went down there and I read, and this elderly man in a wheelchair, he kept saying all these things. He eventually told me, he said that he had met with all these world leaders, the Prince of Spain, Charles de Gaulle, and people were asking him to quiet down. We had sat down at a lovely Persian lunch they had made, because there's lots of food in both the books. But honestly, I didn't believe him. But later, when I told my father about this gentleman, he had an Iranian name, I told him his name. My father said, oh, that was one of our most decorated dignitaries. He met the Prince of Spain. He traveled with Charles de Gaulle. So everything he was saying was true. And I remember just being very humbled by the fact that A, I hadn't necessarily believed him, but B, what was it like for this gentleman to be in an assisted living center with this past that a lot of people didn't believe? Or maybe they believed it and they didn't care. And that became the kernel, that became the seed for the next book, for the stationery shop. I started with just this image of an elderly Iranian man in an American senior center. And then it's not the story of that gentleman's life at all, because it quickly became a love story. And I knew I wanted to set part of the book in 1953, because as do I, that 1979 was a huge marker in Iranian history, but so was 1953. I had lived through 1979 as a child, but not through 1953, but I'd always heard about the coup d'etat, and I was always curious about it. And I thought, if I write a book about it, perhaps it'll force me to do the research. So I did a lot of research. I read books, nonfiction accounts about that time. I tried to talk to every relative I knew who had lived during that time. Some people didn't want to talk about it, some did. The person who helped me the most was truly my father. Both my parents helped me a lot, sharing memories of that time, sharing memories down to what were people wearing, what kind of music were they listening to, what specific pastries were being served in the cafes. And so by writing this book, I not only got to uncover this love story that takes place over 60 years, but I also got to talk to my father more than I normally would and have him share his memories with me. And I hope that I got to recreate the Tehran that my parents knew at one point. So that was the stationery shop. And yes, Khanum Khemsi said that it is being adapted into a show for HBO, which is very exciting. It's another huge breakthrough. I don't think there has been a television show, an American television show, where most of the characters are Iranian, and where most of the story takes place in Iran. And this, hopefully, if all works out, which we don't know, but hopefully, inshallah, will be a global audience for this story so that people across the world can see Iranians in their triumphs, in their heartbreak, in their joy, in their sadness, in their complicated, nuanced lives, just like they see other nationalities, and enjoy it. So I guess what I hope to do with all my books, and I'm currently working on the third, is to not just tell a story about Iran, but to tell a story about people who are Iranian, yes, specifically Iranian with their traditions, their culture, their language, their history, but these stories are universal. And I think the best stories, hopefully, are specific and yet universal. So they're entertaining, we hope, and yet moving. And unfortunately, it was a big convincing process to make people believe that that kind of enjoyment could come from stories about Iranians for an American audience. So that's really most of my talk. I do want to share with you something very short from the stationery shop. So the stationery shop is, this is the hardcover, this is the paperback. Obviously, a lot of the story takes place in a stationery shop. So I'm just going to read a short passage. The first time as a reader you would encounter the stationery shop, and then I'll tell you a little bit about, well, the story behind the story of the stationery shop. Boys had no trouble finding their way from their own schools to the girls' school to linger by the gates at dismissal time. Abbas, the school guard, shouted and shooed them away. "You sons of dogs," he yelled, "leave these girls alone, you'll burn in hell." Roya ignored the boys who followed them home, but Zari made sure the good-looking ones saw her twirl her thick dark hair, especially if Yusuf was in the mix. Some days the boys appeared at every street corner, round every bend. Slick, sly, clever boys who winked and whistled and flirted. Handsome, smart boys with charming smiles. Quiet, shy boys who sneaked an occasional glance at them, then reddened when caught. Roya got used to them the way one gets used to annoying flies, which meant she never got used to them. Roya's favorite place in all of Tehran was the stationery shop. It was on the corner of Churchill Street and Hafez Avenue, opposite the Russian embassy and right across the street from her school. Roya loved running her fingers over tablets of smooth pages in that shop. She loved the boxes of pencils that smelled like lead and promised knowledge. She could spend an entire afternoon just looking at fountain pens and ink bottles, or flipping through books that spoke of poetry and love and loss. The shop was simply called the stationery shop, no fancy name to it, but it was a bookstore as much as a stationery store. As the political divisions deepened that winter and hot-headed people engaged in debates and demonstrations all over the streets, it was the perfect retreat of quiet and learning. It was a sanctuary of calm, never overlit, never loud. Okay, I'll stop there. But that's our first intro to the stationery shop. And then that's the day when Roya, having walked into the stationery shop, which is her favorite place to hang out in her city, she meets Bahman, this boy her age who sort of comes in like the wind, like the warrior, and they fall madly in love. They fall madly in love in a whirlwind way, the way 17-year-olds fall madly in love. And they're engaged to be married, and they have set up a time to meet in the square to get their to go to the office of marriage certificates and divorce. But on the day that they're supposed to meet, a coup d'etat breaks out in the streets, and Roya is caught up in the coup, literally caught up in it, and looks for Bahman, can't find him, searches for him desperately. Afterwards, she realizes not only didn't he show up, but he's getting married to somebody else. And she's shocked and heartbroken. And she ends up leaving and coming to the US. She goes to Mills College in California, marries Walter, moves to the East Coast, the Boston area eventually. And 60 years go by until, through a twist of fate, she is able to find out where Bahman is and is reunited with him again for the first time in 60 years in an assisted living facility in the Boston area. And they see each other again at the age of 77 and understand what happened. So as I was researching this book, again, my father had mentioned the stationery shop that he used to go to after high school. This one is made up, but obviously I got certain ideas from that shop. I remember going to stationery shops as a child myself in Iran. You know, they always also sold books. And the one my father used to frequent, he said that the owner would sometimes pass love notes that the teenagers wanted to exchange. He would pass the love notes in between the pages of the books so that the teenagers could communicate with one another. This is before texting and the internet and email and all of that. So I thought that was just such a beautiful sort of concept. And those of you who've read it know that that's a big part of this book, the love notes in between the pages. So I wanted to also share with you a few other things I have. The book has been, well, together now, both books have been translated into over 20 languages. I don't have many of them because of COVID, because of the pandemic, the supply chain issues. There are many, I don't know, they're on a ship somewhere, but I have the Turkish, this is Turkish. I have the French one that Mrs. Khemsi was mentioning. This won a prize in France, which is a great honor. And this is the UK version. This is what's sold in the UK and India. And this is the Norwegian version. So there are other versions. I don't have them, but people write to me and it's just continuously feels like magic, because I was told this wouldn't happen for so many years. And so the fact that people are reading about Iranians and enjoying their stories means the world to me. Okay, I've talked a lot. I feel like I should stop and we should open it up to Q&A, because I'm not very technical, so I don't really have a good slideshow for you.
Thank you, Marjan. This was beautiful. It was a very, very wholesome and I want to say delicious way of putting your experience, sharing your journey, as you called it, and really talking about the ups and downs and the pleasures and the magic and everything in between for us Iranians living as Iranians in a different environment. And both subjects from the khastegari all the way to the more political issues in the stationery shop are, of course, front and center for a lot of us. So thank you again. This was very well said.
Thank you.
So we invite questions now, I guess. John, do you see questions? Are you going to?
So I was going to suggest people that if they want to raise their hands, if they go to the reactions and there is a place that they can show hands and I will be able to see that, or they can go to participants and in front of their names, if they hit more, then they can also raise hands. So I wanted to actually start, Marjan, I wanted to echo, first of all, what Ladan Khamsi said regarding your books. I think they come from the heart and they go to the heart, and that's why it's been so successful, not only in Iran, but here. I see that the titles of the stationery shop are different from translation to translation, and you didn't show the Iranian version, the Iranian translation, but that one also says "Ishq dar asr kudeta," which is a different interpretation of the title, which is, again, I think kind of fitting, but it's interesting that all these titles have been changed. Even the UK version says the stationery shop of Tehran. They had to add the Tehran.
Oh yeah, they added of Tehran. That took a lot of negotiation. Yes. Did you,
Right.
I don't know if you have another question or if you want me to talk about the different.
No. That was my first question, and as I said, as soon as we see hands or other people want to ask their questions, I'm sure we'll go to them.
Yes, the titles are very interesting. Every country gets to pick its own title, but it amazes me what people pick. So yes, the UK wanted to add of Tehran. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't want them to. I kept saying, why? It's just the stationery shop. And I thought it would be good to have a consistent title in the English language, but they fought very hard for it. They said that their readers would appreciate a sense of place. So they wanted of Tehran, and it was this huge back and forth. So yes, they got of Tehran. But what amazes me is some of the other titles, which I don't have to show you. In Poland, my book, The Stationery Shop, is called The Scent of Saffron. And I kept telling them, I don't know if it relates to it, but they said, no, people associate saffron with Iran. And so in Germany, Together Tea is called Ein und Tausend Granatenkernel. It's called 1001 pomegranate kernels. And there's a huge picture of a pomegranate on the cover. Oh my gosh, look at my assistant. Yes.
Yeah, that's nice.
That's amazing. Thanks, Conrad. That's my husband. That's amazing. Yes. So there you go. Yeah. That's the German version. And then in the Netherlands, it's called The Snowflakes of Tehran. So they get to pick their titles, and you know, the author, this isn't just me or Iran related, any author with international editions, you don't have that much of a say as to the title they pick. I mean, I don't have that much. I get to chime in, but in the end, they pick what they think is right for their market.
Thank you. Well, we have a few hands up, so I would let Jamshid ask his question.
Thank you, Sajan. Congratulations, particularly for success. But in my opinion, the way that you resisted the pressure at that age of your career, not to submit, change something you believed in, it's great. Really, it's amazing. And it shows a lot from your, I mean, maybe is a cornerstone of your success for the future. Is amazing. Congratulations a lot. Also, I would like to have two quick questions. One is that, do you have any say in making the series for the movie making? Because in many of these movies that go that way, they use lousy accent and a different character, and then they're very superficially look into that kind of culture, which is hurt the movie. And the other question is that, do you get any royalty for your great work from other publishers around the world?
Those are great questions. To your first question, with again, I don't want to scare people, but everything is a fight. Everything you have to push back because the assumption is a stereotype. So with the HBO series, by now things have improved a lot, I think. I had to fight. I said, you cannot, like, please don't show some generic Middle Eastern background and pretend this is Iran or these are Iranian people. So due to the cultural, in my opinion, importance of being accurate, I was successful in becoming a consulting producer. So what does that mean? It means I have a say, especially when it comes to those kinds of things, you know. Already, for example, the cover of this book, originally, this female figure, when they sent it to me, she had on a hijab and a rupush. Okay, she had on a hijab and rupush, which is absolutely fine. But in 1953, yes, women wore hijab, but they wouldn't have worn the manteau of like the 90s or today. So I had to say nope. And actually this one character, due to her background, her choices, wouldn't wear a hijab. Someone else might. So all kinds of things like that. You know, they're just these generic images people have of an Iranian woman. But yes, so with HBO as a consulting producer, I have some say. I also have to give up a lot of rights over the story. So hopefully culturally it can stay true. But if they decide that for a TV show, you know, certain things need to be compressed or changed, I don't have a say over that. I can't say, oh, why did you change my ending or something like that. So many of you have seen lots of adaptations of books turned into movies or TV shows. And maybe you thought that's different than the book. It is different from the book because part of the contract is the author gives the rights to them to change the story for it to make sense for the screen. And I get that because the screen is different than the page. But that being said, they can't, you know, suddenly make them speak Finnish. Like, it's got to be true to the culture, but little things about the story they can change. As to the second part of your question, the royalties, the way it works is every country draws up a contract with the author. So every country sends their own contract to basically my agent, and then they decide the terms, and then I approve or disapprove. Every country except Iran. Iran doesn't, because A, there's the sanctions. So even if they did, we couldn't negotiate or sign with them. And B, because I think there's just, you know, they don't really adhere to the copyright law. So a lot of our contemporary American books by many, many authors are in Iran, translated, but they don't go through the normal procedure of contracts. So from those, no author gets royalties. But from the foreign other countries, you get mostly an advance at first and then royalties. I just have to also say, to be completely honest, no one should do this to get rich. It's not what you think. The royalties and the advance are not. Yeah, they're just. It's a beautiful world publishing, but it's, you know, it's not necessarily the best way to become a millionaire.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jawajan, it's your turn.
سلام و خیلی خیلی ممنون. خیلی خوشحالم که شما رو دوباره می‌بینم و از صحبتاتون استفاده می‌کنم. همینجور که دکتر لطیف‌پور گفتن، من خیلی ممنونم که شما فایت کردید بر علیه استریوتایپ ها. I'm really proud of you. I want to first mention a couple of things that happened to me reading stationery book, and then ask a question. The first thing is that I was born and grew up within walking distance from Sepah Square. Between 1953 and 79, I witnessed 2 more riots in that neighborhood. And reading your book took me back to that neighborhood that I loved so much. So for that, I thank you. It was such a strong connection. The second thing is that my 2 daughters, the younger one's name is Marjan with a different spelling, have the same contrast of characters as Zari and her sister. And I have seen this, and I was reading and I said, this is my story. So for those, I really thank you. It was great reading that book, fantastic. The question is, one other thing is that I think I know, well, I thought I knew what bookstore you were talking about, because that street had a few bookstores and I knew them. But now that you mentioned, I wonder if the name of that stationery shop that your father told you was original with a J, like the French pronunciation, because that was a stationery shop in Tehran that was popular among very young people in that age. Thank you very much. I'm very glad I came and saw you again.
Thank you. خیلی ممنون از محبتتون. Thank you for saying what you said about the fighting. It feels good now. It feels good now in 2022. I can assure you, when I came home that day, I cried a lot. Because I realized it wasn't going to happen for me for a very long time. So at that time, you know, I remember just feeling this deep disappointment, but it was worth it. I couldn't have done it anyway. I wouldn't have done it because that to contribute to the stereotypes it's not something I'm interested in. So thank you for saying that. And it means a lot to me that having lived there, it felt real to you. That's, you know, it was just so much research. My father made sure that all the places I wrote, the street names, everything is geographically correct. So, and also it surprised me that Simon & Schuster cared about that too. They did the research with old maps of Tehran. Roya and Zari have a very interesting sisterly dynamic. And I have a sister, an older sister, and people ask me, are you Roya and Zari? Is that you two? It's not us two, really. I mean, it's not like I'm Roya, she's Zari, or vice versa, but that sisterly dynamic is something I'm very familiar with. So I was trying to capture that. Thank you for saying that. And as for original, I will have to ask my father. Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to ask him.
Very nice. I think that the next question is with Mr. Ali Malihi. Please ask your question.
Marjan, thank you very much. I'm actually Ladan's brother. I haven't read your book, but I really enjoyed your description of the book. And first of all, in Farsi, we say damet garm, well done. It sounds like your novels are actually conducive to being graphic novels. It reminds me of Marjan Satrapi's Persepolis. Have you thought of either writing in that framework, or if someone came and turned your book into a graphic novel, would you work with them to do something like that?
Yeah, you know, I'm so impressed, but I was so moved by Persepolis when I first read it. And it was, I think for so many of us, it was a familiar story, something we could definitely relate to parts of it. I don't have that talent of, you know, drawing the comics to that level. If someone were to approach me, it would obviously be an honor. I could definitely see, yeah, both of them, I could see lending themselves to that. That's a very interesting point you make, because let's talk about the changes that have happened. There's so many, compared to when I started, so many Iranian American writers now, thank God, right? I mean, especially in the young adult genre, there's, and when I say so many, it's ridiculous because there's maybe 10 that I'm thinking of, but for us, that's so many. I mean, I don't know how many American young adult, just American writers there are, but for us, just to have about 10 is amazing. And yeah, some of them do graphic novels, but I haven't, for my own work, really pursued that at all. It's I don't have the skill. But thank you.
Thank you so much. If I don't see a lot of hands, but Ladan Khanum has been waiting patiently. She's got a few questions, but she wanted to make sure that other people first have their chance. So I'll turn it to Ladan Khanum.
Thank you, Saeedjan. I should say that, Marjan, I have to ask you for a together tea to ask all my questions. Otherwise, the whole evening will be my questions. But I was wondering, you know, I've listened to some of your other interviews and things, and you have a very nice way of describing your note-taking and your notebooks, and also give us an idea of what a day in a life of a writer looks like. Do you write every day? Do you, you know, how do you go about your writing?
Well, that's a great question. I do it here. So this is the room I write in. This is This is actually my father's chair that was in the house we lived in for 35 years. It's very bad for my hip, but sometimes I use another chair. But anyway, there's a lot of superstitions involved. You can imagine if I wrote a book called The Stationery Shop. I love stationery, and people are always surprised that I write a lot of these books by hand. So, you know, I use the computer obviously, but I also write by hand. And on this desk, I have the notebook. So every time I start a book, I start a new notebook, a big notebook. This is the notebook for The Stationery Shop. It's literally right here because I still, you know, discuss my writing process when I visit book clubs a lot. And it's got research notes here. There's a map of Old Tehran my father drew for me, you know, just like he wrote Nauderi Street, everything, so that I could look at the map. And then I wrote a lot of the scenes by hand, and they then get transcribed into the computer. And then for each book, I have a major notebook, and then I have a secondary notebook. And this is like the crying notebook. This is all the emotional scenes, the scenes that are so, like in The Stationery Shop, there are several scenes where I've been told people cry, and I cried writing them. So I write by hand. I don't write every day. I wish I did. I think, you know, you always hear you should write every day. It's really hard to write every day, especially when you have a family, when you have other demands on your schedule. So I have given myself permission to not write every day. But when I write, it is an incredible escape. You know, I pull down the shades, I close the door. This becomes a cave, this becomes a refuge. And behind me are the books that I've read literally my entire life. So it's in chronological order. You know, everybody organizes their bookshelves differently. Some people do it by color, some people do it by genre. I do it in the order that I read the books. So there's some books from Iran that I brought with us. You know, we had to pick what to bring. I brought books. And I think it's for the people in the audience who want to write their own books, I would say the most important thing to remember is it takes a very long time, and that's okay. You just have to not give up. And if things go badly, come back to it after a little while. The thing I noticed, having later studied creative writing with my classmates at NYU, a lot of them are now published authors, not necessarily the best ones in class, just the ones who didn't give up. So yeah, that's a little bit about the writing process.
Thank you. Can I ask another question?
Yes.
Sure.
Saeed, is that okay?
Of course, please. You have the floor.
In both books, I think food plays a major role.
Yes.
Or it's, you know, food, Iranian food. And of course, we know as Iranians, all of us here, we know what a major role it plays in our lives. How, did you have, I mean, I'm sure it was intentional, but what were your intentions in including such detailed orme sabzis and all sorts of, you know, Iranian foods in your books?
Yes, you know, the first time with Together Tea, everybody after it came out kept saying you included so much food. And I said, did I? Because I didn't intend to do it, but how can you write about an Iranian family without including mehmonis and the feasts and the food? Also, the truth is I love food. I know Said John's wife is one of the best cooks I know, but I love food. I love to cook. My mother taught me how to make all the khoreshes. I make them all the time. So both my children, even though they were born in America and have only been to Iran twice to visit, the food they eat is Iranian food. The food they love is Iranian food. And the second time around with the stationery shop, I included the food deliberately. I intentionally put it in. This time I was aware of it, and I wanted the food to help the characters communicate. When Roya's in Iran, the cooking, the preparation helps her connect with her mother. And then when she moves to the US, making the food helps connect her to her past and helps connect her to her culture and makes her feel at home. And even when she still can't speak English, she makes food, and that's how she communicates with Walter over Khoreshte Badem Jun. So in another life, maybe I would have opened a Persian restaurant. But, yeah. I love
you.
the food.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's really nice. Obviously, food has always played a huge role in Persian culture and brings people together. Good food always brings people together. And as you said, your son and my daughter, who are classmates, are huge fans of Persian food. And my daughter always orders Persian food to her mom. So thanks to her, we're always having good food because
Yes.
she's demanding.
So is my son. My father, my
Okay.
husband says he never eats as well as when they come home.
Right. So it's always good to have those.
Yeah.
Ladan Khamsi, we have another question. I think I see one raised hand.
No, go ahead. If there's any other questions, go ahead.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure, thank
Very
you.
quick question. Do you like Tadiq too?
Tadiq, you know, sometimes when I'm filling out those forms that we have to fill out and it says religion, I want to put Tadiq. I really do. But yeah, I love Tadiq. I love it. And what's so great now is that there's so many wonderful Persian food blogs and Instagram accounts and cookbooks. So after people read my books, they write to me, but they might write about the book, of course, but I often get asked for recipes. So I always direct them to all the wonderful Persian food blogs and social media accounts. I spend a great deal of time looking at those. And one of my favorites, if you haven't looked at it, is Tadiq Lover on Instagram. It's just pictures of Tadiq every single day, different kinds. Highly recommend it.
There's a great Persian cookbook written by کتاب مستطاب آشپزی با نجف دریابندری. That is the one really covers basically everything.
Yes, my mother has that. Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much. I think the next question is actually from Sai.
It's from Sai and Nika.
Hi, Nika. Hi.
Hello. Nika listened to most of your talk and she was like, oh my God, I have to read those books. I'm like, I have them. But my question, our question, because Nika's like, ask it. Our question is, do you write, like, if you get an idea for a chapter or an episode, do you write it separately and then work it into the book somewhere?
That's such a
Do you
good
jump
question.
around?
I do. Especially, you know, when you're in the first draft and you don't know the whole story yet, or at least I don't know the whole story. In that first draft mode, whatever you get, whatever you have, I would say write it down. So yes, I do write it down. And with the stationery shop, the ending came to me and I quickly took the notebook. It's actually in here. And I wrote it. I sat down, I wrote it. And then I didn't know how to get from where I was to to that scene. But yes, I jump around. Whatever I can grasp, I write down whenever it comes, because it's like a puzzle. And sometimes when you start writing your book, you might know pieces of it, but you don't know how they all fit together. And part of the joy, really, also part of the difficulty, is figuring out how they all fit together. So yes, I jump around a lot, and it's lovely to see Nika. That's so good.
Thank
And
you.
Saida.
She's home for the holiday weekend.
So we
I
know
have
there's good food happening. Yes.
Oh yeah, and Said will come and eat after.
I asked her to make tagine tonight, but she denied me.
Oh, you have to make the tagine.
I'll make it. She's here for a couple more days. Yeah.
That's good to you.
My other question, what was I going to ask?
I don't know.
Oh, never mind.
That happens to me.
I know. You had told me that everything in the stationery shop was fact checked.
Oh, yes.
In terms of historical authenticity. Who does that?
Great question. What happens is when you finish your manuscript and it goes to the publisher. So in this case, I finished it and it went to my editor at Simon & Schuster. Not the editor, but they hire a special person called a copy editor. And the copy editor fact checks, even though it's fiction, they fact checked all the political sort of statements I made and the historical concepts and parts that I wrote. So the copy editor was this separate person. This is what she does for a living. And she fact checked everything, especially when you're writing based on true events. So like the coup d'etat, especially when you're writing about a country like Iran, which is always controversial, they wanted to be sure for their own sake to fact check what I wrote. And she would come back with the strangest things. Like she would say, oh, you wrote Hafez Street, but it was actually Hafez Avenue, down to that level.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is that always done with any historical fiction? Is there always fact checking done?
I think when you're dealing with like a major political event, they do fact check, because even though it's historical fiction, you can't sort of make up stuff about the true event. You can make up things about the characters and what they did or didn't do, but the actual facts of the event, you know, are true to life. So yes, I think they do that with a lot of fiction, especially with historical fiction set in other countries. And the other thing they were very, very particular about was, again, the geography of Tehran. You know, like I even at one point I said, when Roya and Zari are leaving the US, Iran, I said they drove through and went to the house where their mother had grown up. And then they told me, say the street name. And so I had to come up with a street name that would have been that part of Tehran. Yeah, and they looked at maps of Tehran from the 50s.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladan Khamsi, it's your turn again.
I hate to be asking so many questions, but you know, each question brings up something else for me. So I'm like inspired by all this. So my question is about the characters and how you develop them. And what's your inspiration for the characters in your books? And are they usually based on real people, or are they composites of several people? And do you get attached to these characters, any of them?
Oh, wow. You know, people, a lot of authors say their characters are entirely made up. And if you were just to ask me point blank, are these characters entirely made up? I would say yes. But at the same time, every character you write is going to borrow some characteristic from people you may know or yourself. So I think the most accurate way to answer your question, Ladan Khanum, is to say they're a composite. They're composites of people I've known and characters I've met. What was the second part of your question?
Do you get attached to any of them?
Oh, I do. I get so attached. So attached that it's just, it gets,
because as readers, I'm sure we get attached to certain characters. It's natural for a reader, but I'm wondering as a writer.
Yes, because, you know, I spend years with them. As a reader, sometimes people tell me, oh, I read your book in one day, which is great. You know, it's a compliment. But I've spent years with them, so I get so attached. I'm not alone. And in fact, when this book finished, when the stationery shop finished, I found it really difficult to start a new book. I just wasn't ready. And my agent said to me, you're just too attached. And I have a lot of writers I know who are so attached. So what you need to do is you need to write a letter and you need to say goodbye to them. And I did. There's a lot of crazy things I do. So I sat down, I wrote a letter to Roya, to Bahman, to Mr. Fakhri, and Mrs. Aslan. You can imagine that was
Yes. That letter should have been very interesting.
Yes, it was a very interesting letter. And, you know, I said what I had to say, and then I said goodbye to them. And it was, again, it might just be superstition, but it was only after I wrote the letters that I was able to start the new book. Because, you know, it's like they become very real to you. They're very real to me. I don't think of them as kind of characters I made up. I really think of them, to me, they're real. So I think about them even
understandable.
now. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you tell us anything about your new book or what you're working on? I mean, not to spoil the stories or anything. I know that, but is there anything that you can share?
Yes. So, you know, before I joined you tonight, I was here. I didn't have this nice blazer on, but I was here at this desk. This is the new notebook. So again, every time I start with a notebook, and I've got all my different sections and, you know, situations. Once again, this book will take place in Iran and the US. And once again, the characters are Iranian and Iranians in the diaspora. And this time it's a friendship story. So the stationery shop was a romance, right? A love story. This is a friendship story. And yes, I've gotten attached again, except one of the main characters' names keeps changing. So yeah, she's still forming. Yeah. So that's all I can say about it, because it's still a work in progress, but it's, you know, it's a new adventure. And every time you start a new book, in a way, it's like climbing a mountain. If you've climbed a mountain before, it makes it easier, yes, but you still have to climb the mountain. You don't get to, you know, there's no shortcuts.
No easy routes, right?
Yeah.
No, but I personally can't wait, and I'm sure many people share that, you know, for your new book to read. You know, I first of all, you know, thank you so much for spending the time with us. I think that, you know, I've known you and you come across as very genuine and warm, and, you know, you want to keep talking. You know, I am sure that if we, you know, keep the floor open, you will hear, you know, many more questions. But I also want to be respectful of your time with your family. And again, on behalf of Iranian Association of Boston and many of us, thank you. Thank you, Ladan Khamsi, for really taking part in this with us and being, you know, such good questions and care, and Mr. Latifpur who are the partner in crime always for his programs and has done many of his own programs. So with that, I like to thank all the participants for joining us tonight. I know that people are looking to see the time that they missed, and I think this video will be available in the next month or two on IAB's YouTube channel. So anyone who's missed any part of the talk tonight, they can definitely log on to the IAB's YouTube channel give it a few weeks. And if you don't get anything, please write to the Cultural Committee of IAB and we should be able to give you an answer. With that, I will like to go back to Marjan and say goodnight to everyone. Marjan.
Thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. Thank you for having me. Thank you to IAB for all their great programming. It was an honor to be with you and to share my story with you. So I hope everybody has a good evening, a good weekend. And those of you in the Boston area, I hope to see you. John, I hope to see you. Ladan Khamsi, thank you for your wonderful, wonderful questions and for being such a great moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Mr. Latif.
Thank you all. Have a very good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Marjan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.